Okay, welcome to the 12th meeting of the 46th year of the Rotary Club of Dublin and Worthington. Today's invocation and pledge of allegiance will be given by Tim Modes.
Would you pray with me, please? Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us all together this afternoon. On this early fall day, we thank you for the beauty of your creation all around us, and thank you for the rain which has gently watered the earth the past few days. Sometimes our spiritual lives can become parched from the circumstances swirling around us. We thank you for gently watering our souls. We thank you for all your many blessings, and thank you for the technology that brings us all together. In your name we pray, amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Tim. We normally have Steve will introduce any visiting Rotarians. And he is not here today, so I'll go ahead and I don't think I see any visitors except for our speaker. And I will introduce Glenn a little bit later. So are there any happy dollars? My goodness, there are no happy dollars.
I'll do a happy dollar. So
Good, Jennifer.
We just got back from a great trip to Zion National Park. We had to be in LA for a business trip last week and stopped at Zion, and we were impressed with the airlines and the cleanliness and the hotels and sanitizing, and everybody in California and Utah wearing masks inside and outside, and we felt very safe and had a good trip. We got some hiking in. We hiked the Narrows up at Zion, which has been Bill's goal with his new knees to be able to do that. So it was a great accomplishment. That's like probably worth 5 happy dollars.
I have a happy dollar. I don't see myself, but anyway, yesterday our 5th great grandkid was born. So I have a happy dollar. And what do I do? Send it to you, Jennifer?
Yep, you can send it to me.
Okay. Anyway, what will you put in my account?
You know what? I can bill you for it if you want that. I'll take notes here.
Yeah, do that. It's easier than that. Okay, so anyway, Walter something. He was born yesterday, and he is a bit premature, so it's touch and go for a few days. He was 23 days premature. He's 6 pounds, but he had a brother that had the same thing, and the brother's doing fine. So we are hopeful that everything is fine.
Go ahead, Ann. Leslie has something on here, but go ahead, Ann.
I was actually going to have the same happy dollar as Abram, because I know Michael, and I was like, hey, yay, another baby. And also he got a new job at a law firm, and so I was very, very impressed, because his grandson used to be part of my book group when he was in 8th grade, and I've known him since he was probably 12, 13 years old. And so it's awesome. And he's like, yes, I even actually mentioned the teen book group and also the teen advisory board in my interviews to the law firm. So I'm very, very, very proud of I'm very, very proud of him. So you raised a good grandson.
You can bill Abe for $25 for the foundation Grandparents Club. this is the great grandparents, but it still applies. We won't increase it to $35. It's just 25.
Still the same, okay.
We have a,
Jim, I already paid for the foundation, the $85. So we'll let it go at that, Jerry.
Pete Scotland. Judy and I put $10 in my basket, Jennifer Best, on my bill for next time. And here's where we are. We're back in a great place. You're looking at the intercoastal of Siesta Key and the mainland Sarasota, and we're thrilled to be back. Thank you.
Yes, Alan.
I will throw in a couple of happy dollars. One, because I was really happy that we did get together last night for that Porous for Polio. That was a lot of fun. And two, with pride for my wife Heather, who has started her own consulting firm effective Monday.
Great.
Great. Good for Heather.
Mhm.
I have two happy dollars. One is that we had a great trip to the Hocking Hills on Friday and Saturday, and the fall foliage was at its peak, and it was sunny and warm. And the other one is that our church has what's called a learning extension center. So we're providing Wi-Fi and tutoring for Columbus City school students who are trying to do their education online.
That's terrific.
I also have a happy dollar. This is Dave Hansen. I just want to throw $1 in because I'm very happy that we'll be watching Big Ten football this summer and not have to watch SEC football.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay, any others? I think there are a lot of folks that are
there's,
very happy about the OSU Bucks beginning again.
there's one in the chat, Jim. Jennifer Heasley has a happy dollar.
Oh, okay.
Her nephew, Ikenna, also has learning disabilities, has all A's and B's this year thus far in all classes. I'm so proud. Good job, Jen. Glad to hear that.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah. Pleased to hear that. Okay, let's move on to announcements. Anyone with any announcements today? I think I have Alan down. We'll talk a little bit more. He has a little presentation. Jerry, did you want to mention what's going on with the food drive? No, okay. I will mention we are beginning organizing for an online auction that will replace this year our silent auction that normally is held at a holiday event. However, we will probably not be holding a holiday event live or in person. So we've decided to move on, and Shirley has agreed and is working on now the collection of items. So do look around your home and think through what items you can contribute. The one thing that we will not be able to do is ship or have alcohol or tobacco products online for this particular company. They are not permitted to do that. So otherwise, it can be almost anything you can think of. And we'll give you more information in the near future, but begin thinking about what you can contribute. Before I introduce the speaker, I would like to ask you to silence your cell phones until the speaker asks for questions. And then you can unmute yourself and respond to those. Oh, the next piece is Alan has a short presentation. Go ahead, Alan.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to spend about less than 5 minutes on this 30-minute presentation for the district. I want to talk, of course, about Polio Plus, and certainly thank you all for coming, those that did last night online, and of course for everybody that made contributions. As you all may remember, this coming Saturday, the 24th, is World Polio Day, and as you know, Rotary has been very instrumental in the eradication of polio. We're down to just 2 countries, and this video will shed some light on that.
For each of us, there are moments that define us. Moments where we fought for what we believed. When we pushed the boundaries to the unknown. Moments that remind us of a past we cannot accept, and that create within us the desire to take a stand and do something. 30 years ago, polio was claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of children just like me. There was a vaccine that could help stop it, but it wasn't reaching all of us. Until you decided to step in and do something. You decided to find a way to reach us all, no matter where in the world we might be. It all started with one small project. And 6 million children were saved from polio forever. The world took notice, and things began to change. On streets, on trains, planes, boats and bicycles, over deserts and rivers, mountains and valleys, through jungles and war zones, you never stopped. But it can't end here. We are this close, the closest that we've ever been. 3 countries remain, and we must continue to strive to reach every last child. Because every life truly does matter. And together, you have proved that when you put service above self, the world can be a much better place.
Since 1985, Rotary has been the foundation on which the polio eradication program is built.
Last year, we saw just 37 cases, the lowest number in history.
Thanks to your efforts, more than 16 million people are walking today who would otherwise have been paralyzed.
Thanks to your vision, humanity is on the verge of one of the greatest public health achievements in history.
While our work is not yet done, the remarkable dream that you had 3 decades ago to tackle one of the world's greatest public health challenges, the end of polio, is nearly a reality.
Thanks to you, we truly are this close to ending polio.
Thanks to you, we are truly this close to ending polio.
Okay. So a couple of highlights that I'll share with you and then turn this back over to Jim. As you may know, when we took on this initiative, there were 350,000 cases per year. That's per year of polio being reported around the world. The video just talked about how there are 3 countries left. Nigeria was actually just declared polio free. Therefore, there are now only 2, Pakistan and Afghanistan, which, as you might imagine, is very challenging to get to, both because of the terrain, the fact that the people believe that we are that the U.S. is going there to sterilize their people, and on top of that, as you might imagine, there's been quite a setback due to this COVID pandemic around the globe. That said, the mission now is to raise $750 million, which of course there's a large amount of 2-to-1 contributions being made by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation still. And the organization feels that this $750 million will help us to eradicate polio around the globe in the next 5 years. So we are not quite at our goal of what we set out to do, which I believe was $1,250. I think that was what we set our target as. We're a little bit short of that, and I don't have an exact number yet because it's just not all tabulated quite yet. And on top of that, the district goal for us would like every club to generate $1,500, and I think through our annual contributions on top of what we do this month with Polio Plus, we will probably make that. So if at any point in time anybody has questions or wants to make comments about Polio Plus, I'm happy to hear. I think that I've got another idea that we might show up with coming up in November. So thanks so much, Jim, and thanks for everybody listening and participating in this great project.
Just because we held the, thanks, Alan, for the presentation and last night's event. And just because we held last night's event doesn't end our drive to raise that $1,250. And I encourage everyone to become part of this effort. Well, today is kind of, I've been looking forward to this presentation for about 6 weeks, and appreciate Jennifer's help in arranging the speaker. It is, today's speaker is Lennon Sweeney. She is a senior researcher at the Kiwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. Glennon joined Kiwan Institute in 2015. Her work in metropolitan neighborhood change seeks to understand the structural drivers of poverty and wealth accumulation. All of Glennon's research is designed to generate real-world impacts. At the Kiwan Institute, Glennon is engaged freely in transformative scholarship aimed at eliminating racial disparities. She holds a bachelor's degree in geography and political science, a master's degree in city and regional planning, and working on her PhD in regional planning at the Ohio State University. She also is a local. She grew up in Worthington. She is dedicated to the community and is a member of the Worthington Community Relations Commission and the Franklin County Local Food Council. Her topic is the making of metropolitan inequality, the formation of metropolitan space, explores the policies and processes that segregated our region through the lens of creation of suburban spaces. She will be speaking specifically about Worthington and Dublin, and I very much appreciate her willingness to share her time and insights with the club today. Glennon?
Thank you. And thanks for having me, everyone. It's always great to give talks in my stomping grounds. I actually grew up in Old Sawmill, so most of the neighborhood actually is Dublin, in the Dublin School District at least. So I kind of grew up in that area between Worthington and Dublin, and I'm very familiar with both communities. I am gonna focus mainly on key policies that have created our segregated societies. Once I got into making this, I just did not have enough time to go through the suburban lens. That just takes 2 hours, quite frankly. And I could get it down to maybe an hour, but I couldn't get any smaller. So we're going to start by kind of thinking about, you know, the American dream, right? Work hard and you can have it all. And this is kind of, I know that, you know, I was raised to believe that, you know, anyone could pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I think many of us were, but the American reality is that not everyone who works hard achieves the American dream. I know people that I personally know who work more than 40 hours a week, more than one job, and live in neighborhoods like the one on the left. Oh wait, I'm not sharing my screen. I'm so sorry. Here we go. Now can you see my screen? Can you all see the PowerPoint? All right, I'm so sorry about that. I totally spaced that. Let's see if I can make you guys any bigger so I can see you. There we go. Be able to see y'all. I like to look at people I'm talking to. So, you know, but there are a lot of people that work, you know, multiple jobs, you know, over 40 hours a week and live in neighborhoods like the one on your left, you know, and there are people who live in communities like Worthington and Dublin. I have a friend, actually, I have friends who live in Worthington and inherited money. They don't work 40 hours a week. They don't even have a job, actually. And they live the American dream. And at Kirwan, one of the things we want to wonder a lot of times is, well, why is this, right? And when we look around and we start to think about mapping inequality, we start to see patterns. Sorry, there we go. We start to see spatial inequality from birth to death. So this is a map of infant mortality in Franklin County. And you can see the kind of red and yellow areas are hotspots. The more red, the more rates of infant deaths. And you can see there's kind of this upside down T that you see that runs south of I-70 and east of I-71, going all the way up to Northland, all the way down to the south side, all the way out to the hilltop, and then out to the far east side on the other side. And then when we map opportunity, and opportunity we take is an index that we created at the Kirwan Institute that really looks at, you know, schools, housing and neighborhood, crime, those opportunity structures. A lot of them are social determinants of health. And the darker areas are higher opportunity. You can see Worthington and Dublin are in the real high opportunity areas. And the lighter colors are very low and low opportunity. You can see again that upside down. You can see it again with poverty. Darker colors are higher poverty. Upside down T, same pattern following those highways. Incarceration, same thing. This is senior vulnerability and density. So the dark red and orangish colors are the places where there are more seniors who are more vulnerable. With the exception of Bexley here that sticks out like a sore thumb, that has a high density of seniors, but a low vulnerability, you can again see that upside down T. And then we have life expectancy. And this is one of the most troubling maps I've ever seen for Franklin County, quite frankly. You see the bright kind of neonish colors, highlighter style colors, those are your low life expectancy tracks. And you can see Dublin has the highest life expectancy track of all. 85 plus, highest life expectancy up there in Dublin in that corner of the county where some of you might even live. Worthington also has some of the higher tracks in it as well. But Franklinton and the Hilltop have some of the lowest, with the south side and part of Linden. The difference in life expectancy between that high track up in Dublin and that lowest track here in Franklinton is 26.7 years. And I want you to think about that for a minute, all right? If people are living to be 85 plus in that census tract in Dublin, and people are dying 26.7 years earlier on average in that census tract in Franklinton, that means they're dying before they're old enough to technically be considered seniors, to get Social Security, to be able to get the benefits of being a senior. But that most likely they were living the lived experience of being a senior due to cumulative disadvantage in their life in their 40s and 50s and couldn't access services. They probably had those health conditions. They might not have had health insurance though, because this is a low income track as well. 26.7 years based on where you live. So we see this spatial inequality from birth to death. Let's talk about what explains it. And so I'm going to argue that policy, inequality in the United States is due to policy. There's this really pervasive narrative in the United States that poor people are poor because they're lazy, because they make bad choices, because they're not good people. And that is simply a false narrative. It has been disproven over and over again by researchers. Poor people are poor because of structures we've created, and those structures were created through policy and law. And as a country, we've made a choice, a conscious choice, that poverty is something we are okay with. And so let's talk about those policies. Now, if I had like 4 hours or half of your day, we could like go back to 1619 and start at the very beginning of all of this, because inequality in the United States is very much rooted in race. But we don't have time. So we're going to focus on 20th century policies because those are really the ones that created the most difference. And so we're going to start with this idea of restrictive covenants. And so I'll get a little bit into the formation of suburbs, because the way that metropolitan space was created is through 3 distinct processes of white flight. And these processes of white flight happen. We have this early era that we call escape from the suburbs. All right, and this is when the first planned suburbs were being built. This is 1890s to about 1945, to really the war. All right, and the beginning of the post-war era. It kind of ends when the war ends. But this era of suburbanization is when you had investment groups start buying plots of land with enough capital to be able to build developments over a longer period of time. These investment groups were made up of, oftentimes, and many of them, especially the first ones, were made up of people who were usually the same people who were funding British colonial exploits all over the world. So there are also deep ties to colonialism in the creation of the suburbs. But what these people wanted to do is they wanted to create communities that were separate from cities, because cities were considered unclean. They were considered unclean for a number of reasons. One, because they actually were dirty. All right, sewer systems were just starting to be put into place at the turn of the century. All right, so we didn't have a lot of sewers. Rivers were really sewers. You want to know why? The south in Columbus, the further south you go, it's almost like you go north, it gets whiter and wealthier. You go south, it gets poorer and it gets more diverse. And part of that is because this river flows south, and rivers were the original sewers. So undesirable land uses, undesirable people were pushed to where the rivers flowed, because you didn't want to live downriver, because that's where all that was your sewer. But these first early suburbs, what they wanted to do is they wanted to get away from the city, and the dirtiness of the city was connected to people. And there was a racial hierarchy of the time with white Protestants at the top. All right. And then below them, you had other whites, but the vilified whites were Eastern Europeans, Catholics and Jews. And Eastern Europeans, a lot of them were Catholic and Jews. So there was a lot of mix between region and religion and how these things played together. And then people of color went underneath that. And these suburbs were built for those white Protestants. And so what they started to do is they started to think, how can we create in the deeds of these properties restrictions that make sure that only the people we want to live in this community, the white Protestants, can live here? So they started to target characteristics of poverty, right? We're going to say that you need to have a minimum amount that you're going to spend on your house when you construct it, a construction price, a minimum price that you spend, so that we make sure that people aren't using cheap materials or building small houses. And you have a minimum square footage size for the house that you build on your lot. We're going to say, you know, a lot of African Americans were the most common people to use, you know, small plot agriculture in their backyard, you know, gardening, and, you know, chickens and things like that. So we're going to ban all agriculture. All right. And you know what? We are just so, we really don't want Blacks. We really don't want Jews or Catholics. So we're just going to come right out and we're going to ban non-white people, anyone who isn't Caucasian, and a racial restriction like this. We're going to make racial restrictions, and we're going to make religious restrictions. Everybody know about Bexley? Bexley's the hub of the Jewish community in Franklin County, right? Well, Bexley was the first wealthy community that Jews were able to break religious restrictions in. Look at Bexley today. There is not one Catholic church inside of Bexley city limits, and that is because Catholics remained restricted for a number of years after Jews were able to get into Bexley. But that's why Bexley is the hub of the Jewish community. So they had these restrictive covenants and they built them into these property deeds. And after a little while, they started to codify these into laws and zoning codes. Notice in most suburbs, you can't have farm animals. It's in the zoning code. There's a racial origin to that zoning code. Minimum lot sizes, let's keep out poor people. Minimum house sizes, let's keep out poor people, who were overwhelmingly also non-white. And the first citywide zoning ordinance implemented in 1910 in Boston, Massachusetts was racial. It designated this residential area Black and this residential area white. Baltimore did something similar. They did it street by street. In Columbus, they zoned Blacks to live near railroad tracks. And so we're going to tell you where you can live. Now, this was struck down after 7 years, which you would think isn't a lot of time. But this is 7 years in the beginning of the 20th century when cities were undergoing immense growth. And residential patterns, settlement patterns were being set. So that 7 years of racial zoning was incredibly impactful on core urban cities in terms of who lives where and why. All right. And so now, well, we had white people building suburbs for white safe spaces that were clean spaces, right? These new suburbs that were being built, there were Black people also building suburbs for Black communities. And there were lots of Black suburbs all over the place. And one of the things that started happening, and this is where it becomes very obvious and very apparent, that a lot of these policies were really designed to do one key thing. They were designed to make sure that certain groups, particularly African Americans and non-whites, weren't able to accumulate property. And the reason why property was targeted is because in the 20th century in the United States of America, property was the primary mechanism by which Americans built wealth. And so if you can't own property, it's very difficult to build wealth. So we had, the Depression, and then we had the New Deal. And as part of the New Deal, there was a bunch of legislation around housing because we had a housing crisis. We mortgages from a 15-year mortgage where you're only paying on the interest, you're building no equity, and you have a 50% down payment and a 50% payment due at the end. So home ownership was exclusive to the mortgage that we know of today. But that required this new thing, federal mortgage insurance. All right. And if we're going to have this new federal mortgage insurance, we need to figure out which neighborhoods are too risky to loan to. Because we don't want, if we're going to insure all these loans, we don't want to insure risky loans. So they created the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation was tasked with grading neighborhoods for risk. This is redlining. This was determining, these colors determine the percentage of your mortgage that qualified for federal mortgage insurance. So it determined your down payment. A-grade neighborhoods qualified for 80% of the value of their home. This is the mortgage we know of today with the 20% down payment. B-grade neighborhoods, places like Worthington, which we also had some C-grade area, and we can talk about why Worthington got its grades. Dublin is not on the map. Dublin was not yet connected to metropolitan Columbus in the 30s when this map was made. So it's 36. There were two maps for Columbus, actually. Worthington was A-graded, green on the first one. It was B on the second. And we don't know why, because we don't have the notes from the assessors, but I believe it has to do with the African Americans living in Old Worthington. And you can see even like the Flint Road area where there were African Americans living also at the time was graded C. And so when the assessors would call this infiltration, when you would see a group that was undesirable. It could be Eastern Europeans, it could be, Hispanics in certain parts of the country, Asians, African Americans in this part of the country were the primary group that was targeted. It could be Jewish people even, and they would usually say Eastern European though, and name the countries. In the case of religion, they weren't as explicit on the assessor notes that I've seen, but we don't have the notes for Columbus, so we don't really know the reason. But those B grade neighborhoods had a 35% down payment, so 65% of their mortgage was covered. C grade neighborhoods, 15% of their home was covered, so they had an 85% down payment. I want you to think, when you were buying your first home, could you have afforded an 85% down payment? And if your neighborhood was graded yellow or graded red, which by the way was any neighborhood where there were blacks that were considered to be, more than 10% of the population basically. And it didn't matter if they were wealthy. It didn't matter if it was a wealthy neighborhood, a poor neighborhood, a mixed income neighborhood. If there were blacks in a large enough amount, the neighborhood was graded red and they were not eligible for any federal mortgage insurance. So this was a policy that was aimed at disenfranchising people from property ownership. And it was also a policy of disinvestment in these communities. Because if I can't reinvest in my business, so like take King Lincoln, right? And then in downtown Columbus, the King Lincoln neighborhood was our Brownsville. It was the core of the African-American community. It was a mixed race, mixed income community. It was primarily Jewish and Black. You had, and in the 30s, in the United States, because of racism and segregation, most Black communities had their own kind of separate microeconomies. There was a hospital in that neighborhood for Black people. There was, they had more theaters in the King Lincoln district than anywhere else in Columbus. There were lots of businesses. There were Black doctors, lawyers, business owners. When that neighborhood was redlined, and that neighborhood is right here, by the way, when that neighborhood was redlined, these people couldn't reinvest in their businesses. They couldn't get a loan to reinvest in their business. They couldn't get a loan to reinvest in their home without, well, they just couldn't get it actually because they couldn't qualify for federal mortgage insurance. So it disinvested in these neighborhoods. So why are there neighborhoods that look like that picture at the beginning of, well, I argue this has something to do with it. And if you notice, look at these red line places. Look at this shape. That's kind of an upside down T. And that sets patterns. And those patterns have very much been set by this map. Oh, I explained this, sorry. Race was a determining factor. I always forget about this slide. I should just delete it. So you would think though, right? If you were living in King Lincoln and you were a wealthy African-American business owner, you would leave. It's what the Jews did. They moved to Bexley. They went from here to Bexley. But because of racial restrictions, Blacks pretty much couldn't go anywhere where you could actually get a mortgage. They just couldn't. And so they were disenfranchised. This was the period, this was leading up to the period of the largest jump in home ownership in the United States history, the largest period of wealth creation in the United States history, the largest group of people moving into the middle class in United States history. And because of these policies, African Americans were disenfranchised from taking advantage of virtually all of those opportunities. And you can see the impact in wealth today because property ownership is about wealth creation, and the disparities in this country are huge. The biggest one is wealth, and it's the most important one because wealth buys you so much in terms of security, in terms of access. And we know that. We're people who live in Worthington and Dublin, and highways played a role too. Remember that upside down T, 70 and 71 play a big role in that. And I don't know about you guys, but I was taught in Worthington schools actually that we built highways for national defense because Eisenhower took a trip across the country and all the tanks got stuck in the mud and it took too long. And how are we ever going to defend our country and get our troops from one side to the other? How are we going to evacuate cities? We don't want our cities to be so dense. There was a deliberate strategy to move people out of cities and suburbanize. Part of that was national defense. If our cities get bombed, we don't want to lose everyone. But highways disproportionately went through C and D grade communities, overwhelmingly. Now, part of that might be because those communities had already experienced decades of disinvestment, starting, when suburbs started to be created and restrictive covenants were first implemented and zoning became racialized, right? So if you're using eminent domain, it's cheaper to go through these areas where land is cheap. But the pattern is undeniable. And where we see inequality today follows these highway lines. Now, oh, black suburbs. Yeah. So we had a lot of blacks who fought in World War II as well, but they weren't able to use their GI Bills largely because of racial restrictions, which even though they were deemed illegal, Shelley v. Kramer was a Supreme Court case, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In 1948, it remained legal until the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968 for me to sue you if you were black and bought the house next to me, because I could sue you for loss of property value. Because blacks were associated with risk. That's what these redlining maps did. And because of that, I could actually go to court and win a case suing you for damaging my property value for just being black and moving in next door. So getting into a suburb was hard. Getting into those high opportunity areas where there are good schools that haven't been disinvested, you know, and taking advantage of suburbanization. And this is all happening during a massive housing shortage that was much, much, much more severe for African Americans. All right. And so finally, a bunch of black suburbs, because there were black suburbs that survived. Now, a lot of them, though, you know, as soon as there were black suburbs, for example, there was one in Baltimore that was built. And as soon as they did their citywide zoning ordinance, they made sure to zone that nice new suburb industrial, so it would lose property value. Urban Crest in Columbus is the only remaining black suburb. Urban Crest was founded in like the early 1900s. It might even been the late 1890s, actually. It was founded very early, didn't incorporate till the 40s or 50s, because the city of Columbus denied it water and sewer access for decades. There's an entire book of files in the city of Columbus archives, and this was a common practice. We're going to stall your development and ability to build wealth through property ownership by not giving you the infrastructure you need, because central cities tend to control water and sewer. Worthington contracts with Columbus for water and sewer, for example. I believe Dublin does as well. But Hanford Village was a little suburb just southwest of Bexley. And Hanford Village, you know, it was a model African-American middle-class community. It had a park, a school, a police station, a community center. It had a little bit of industrial land, a little bit of commercial land. It had, you know, nice little residential area. And when you know, the war ended, they built New Hanford Village, because eventually the FHA did open up some credit for Black GI housing, specifically where they could take advantage of the GI Bill. And so this was one of those communities. Many of them, though, ended up being privately financed because not all of them were able to get that FHA financing. But they was called the New Hanford Village, but it's also known as the Washington Carver Edition. And then about 10, 15 years later, they built I-70, and it was supposed to go right through kind of the bottom portion of Bexley. Bexley lobbied, and instead it split Hanford Village in thirds. The industrial portion was separated from what was left of the residential portion. Most of the commercial portion was ruined, destroyed by the highway. Columbus quickly annexed the property, the value, the industrial portion, and then eventually what's left of the residential. New Hanford Village is really all that remains. On 2014, it was put on the National Registrar of Historic Places. And that beautiful park that community had, you can now, if you're going to Bexley, you can see it right between the entrance and exit ramp for I-70. So you can see that these, you know, policies have long-term impacts that happen today. We saw, you know, in that subprime loan crisis in the you know, 2004, 2008 or so, C and D grade neighborhoods overwhelmingly had the most subprime loans, and they overwhelmingly went to African Americans. And Columbus, Linden was hit hardest. But it's not just policy. There are also practices at play, and real estate. You know, I'll be honest, I'm an urban planner. So urban planners, developers, realtors, we are the most complicit. We are the most complicit in creating our segregated society. And realtors have done some really nefarious things over the years in terms of perpetuating and even creating segregation. For example, the practice of blockbusting, also known as panic peddling, which was done throughout kind of the first half. Well, actually, probably about, not really the first half, but, from the 30s through the school desegregation era. And this was a practice of realtors really capitalizing on white fear of racial integration. So a realtor would sell a house in a neighborhood to a Black family, and there are always housing shortages in this period for African Americans. So they were always buying these houses for more than they were worth. Okay, they'd sell a house to an African American family at a profit, and then they'd literally go door to door in the neighborhood and tell everyone a Black family moved in, but I can get you out with a deal. They'll buy their house for less than it's worth, turn around and sell it to other Black families. So they create neighborhood turnover and they profit off of it. There are even documented cases of realtors paying Black women to push strollers through white neighborhoods to create panic and make people sell their homes. Today, the most common practice is steering. And quite frankly, I think a lot of realtors probably do this implicitly. They're not conscious that they're steering people because they want to make a sale. And you want, and this is the practice where you can have two, there have been multiple studies done on steering where you have two basically identical families, just one is white and one is Black, same credit, same incomes, everything, taken to the same realtor, and they're going to be shown different neighborhoods. The white family is going to be shown a predominantly white neighborhood. The Black family is going to be shown a much more diverse neighborhood or a predominantly Black neighborhood, depending on where you are. And it's very common. It happens all the time. And I do think a lot of it is implicit bias. Some of it may be explicit, but schools also play a big role. And this is really important in terms of Central Ohio in particular. So I just want to overview, there are basically three important Supreme Court cases. There was the original Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, that said separate but equal schools are okay. Then we had 1954, Brown v. Board, right? Separate but equal is unequal. It's inherently unequal. Busing is the remedy. We're ordering busing nationwide. And then there's this case that not a lot of people know about. And this case happened 20 years after Brown. It was in 1974. It's called Milliken v. Bradley. And this was a case that happened in Detroit. Detroit city schools were trying to implement busing. And they just finally looked around and they said, look, we can't. We're 96% Black. If you want us to bus, the remedy has to be at the metropolitan scale. We need to bus with other school districts. They lost. This is one way that many, particularly in the Midwest and Northeast, metropolitan areas remained segregated after Brown. But Columbus did it a different way. And so which one of these lines is not like the other? And I'll just answer this question for you because you're all muted right now. But a lot of people say the green one and it is higher, but the purple one is very different. City of Columbus, and it just keeps growing. So normally I ask this question out loud. I'll just let you contemplate it to yourselves. But what do you know about Springfield, Illinois? And my guess is that you're thinking, why on earth is she asking this? Or you're thinking, Lincoln, or maybe Capitol, or maybe Simpsons. But the reason why I make that correlation is because that kind of confusion and why are you asking this, or I know very little, is kind of the way that people were supposed to respond if you said, what do you know about Columbus, Ohio? Because Columbus, Ohio was supposed to only be a capital, like Springfield. It wasn't supposed to be the second largest city in the Midwest. It was never meant to be that. We had Cleveland as our industrial hub. We had Cincinnati as our economic hub. Columbus was chosen simply for its central location. And actually, Dublin was very close to becoming the capital. Dublin was almost chosen, but they changed their mind and they picked Columbus. And Columbus was the fourth capital, or third, depending on how you count it, because we had Chillicothe, Zanesville, and then Chillicothe again, and then they came to Columbus. They chose the name in a bar. They did name it after Christopher Columbus. But because Columbus was younger, the leaders at the time looked around and they said, well, and they watched. They saw Toledo become surrounded with suburbs. They saw Dayton become surrounded by suburbs. They saw Cleveland become surrounded by suburbs. They watched Akron become surrounded, and they thought they can't grow if they're surrounded. They said, we want to keep growing. And so they leveraged their regional control over water and sewer to create growth boundaries for all those neighboring municipalities. Worthington could only come so far south, and now Columbus surrounds Worthington. Arlington could only come so far east, and now it surrounds Arlington and Grandview, right? Bexley could only come so far north and west. So it created these growth boundaries, and it was able to annex around cities. It also it pursued an aggressive annexation agenda. Franklinton was annexed. Hanford Village was annexed. These were independent places. Linden Heights, now Linden, the community, there was actually a village, Linden Heights, annexed. All of these places annexed because Columbus just has this growth ethos and this growth machine idea. And so they do all of this annexing. And then what you see happen is that you have 1954 Brown v. Board. And then in 1955, you have this really interesting thing happen. The state of Ohio passes a law where they decouple school district transfers from municipal annexations. And they do this to enable cities like Columbus to capture white flight at the expense of their urban school district. Prior to this law, if Columbus annexed, whatever they annexed went to Columbus City Schools. After this law, Columbus could annex, and whatever they annexed could annex into any adjacent school district. That's why I was able to live in Old Sawmill, which is technically Columbus with the Dublin mailing address, but go to Worthington schools. Now, between mid 50s through 65, there were very few divergence. And I actually think most of them were actually happening in the Worthington area, where you saw that there were annexations that did not go to Columbus schools. But this was also the time when we were annexing Northland, what would become Forest Park. All right, that neighborhood was annexed in this time, and it was still part of Columbus. Bethel Road area was annexed at that time, still part of Columbus. And then in 65, you started to see all the boundaries diverge. There were virtually no annexations that were going in tandem with school districts. Every annexation Columbus made went to another school district, all right? And this continued for a while. And then in 1968, Worthington actually approached Columbus and said, we don't like this, because there were already rumblings within, because this is also happening in the backdrop where the NAACP and the Urban League are starting an investigation of the Columbus City School District for operating a separate enclave of Black schools on the Near East Side, okay? So this is happening at the same time. So there's tension building up. There are people in Clintonville who are still living in the Columbus City School Districts and devoted to it, saying this policy is damaging our schools. Those common areas, as they're known, those need to come back to Columbus City Schools. So Worthington approached Columbus and they said, what will it take for permanent boundaries? And that's why I got the brewery on here. Worthington ended up with the brewery in hand to the Columbus City School District. I believe, and Jennifer, you might actually know this better than I do. I think it's the Indian Hills neighborhood. It's right around that area on the very southern part of Worthington, by Linworth, kind of across from go down the dog park, somewhere over there. And I think it was Indian Hills, given the amount of property value and the amount of land. Do you know, Jennifer?
Correct, because I have two girlfriends that grew up there and had to switch from Worthington to Columbus schools during their high school time.
Yep. And that was, I mean, my parents moved in the 80s, and my mom said something and some lady yelled at her about that in a bathroom at the mall.
I'm sure.
That was, 10, 15 years later, but people were it was just so contentious, but it gave Worthington permanent boundaries, which was good because throughout the 70s, this Take Back the Common Areas movement really, really ramped up. This is because there was also a Supreme Court case going through to desegregate Columbus City Schools called Pennick. And that case was determined in 1979, busing was implemented, annexations really slowed at that point. But this is what Columbus looks like compared to Cleveland. You can see how Columbus just took advantage of those openings to annex and leverage their water and sewer, and then kept growing with those school districts, with the schools. And so what you ended up having is by 1986, they brought in this federal mediator and they hammered out an agreement that we know of as win-win, that Dublin is part of, because Dublin has a rather substantial common area, as does Worthington. But Worthington had that other agreement, remember. What win-win did is it was a three-part solution. It's on a 6-year renewal. It made all existing boundaries permanent. It recoupled school district transfers with municipal annexations moving on. And it created a tax sharing arrangement. So, you know, Dublin was paying Columbus City Schools for the students they kind of essentially took, you know, it would be one way of interpreting it, right? Until the last time it was up for renegotiation. And then I believe it was Dublin and it was some other district, and I'm not sure which one. But Dublin and another district decided to stop paying because there's suburban poverty is a real thing. They've got increasing poverty, increasing diversity, and they thought they had better uses for that money. Those common areas have not been taken back. They seem to be relatively stable. I think it would be political suicide for anyone to try and put them back in Columbus schools, quite frankly. But that's kind of where we are. They drive diversity in the common areas. If you're interested in the story, this is literally the best book I've ever read on Columbus. It's got the most information about governance. If you're interested in governance and kind of growth machine politics, Columbus is very much a growth machine, and the history's really interesting. Gregory Jacobs, Getting Around Brown is the book. But this is what we look like today. So these purple areas kind of out in New Albany up here, out in Hilliard out here, those are annexations after 1986. And so you can really see how they slowed down first in the late 70s when we were coming up to that take back the common area. Yeah.
Glenn, we need to wrap it up. We're ending.
Okay, I'm sorry. I cut so many slides too. All right, well, basically, the impact of this on Dublin and Worthington is that, you know, without these common areas, Worthington would be 90% white. Dublin would be, I think, 79% white. Dublin has a very large Asian population. It's, I think, 18% Asian in Dublin. But because of these common areas, the Worthington School District is 78, I think, percent white instead of, or maybe 76, I got to remember the number, instead of 90% white, which it would be if those boundaries had been aligned. So in many ways, while this policy, you know, has nefarious roots in terms of getting around the Brown order, it also has created school districts that are much more diverse than they otherwise would have been, which for our students is actually phenomenal. And it's phenomenal because there have been studies showing that if you give a diverse group of people and a group of people that are, you know, very similar, the same problem, the diverse group of people not only solve the problem faster, they do it better. And so our kids are getting a better education. They're getting better experiences. I'll stop there though. I'm sorry that I tried so hard to cut it down. I apologize. But any questions? Yeah, I think you have to unmute yourself, sir. You're still muted, sir.
Glennon, who's muted?
Abe,
Okay.
There he is. Abe.
I lived the whole thing. We came to this city in 1964, and we ended in Worthington in Colonial Hills, where there was a restriction there, a racial restriction, and of course it got overturned by the Supreme Court, and so it was moved. But we also had the experience of one family who sold to some African American and wrote to the community apologizing for having done so. Of course, at this particular point in that area, then when I was on the school board, I lived through the busing desegregation experience. I do disagree with your assessment of why the boundaries were fixed. It was mostly an economic thing because it was almost impossible to plan for how the district would develop unless there were that. And then at that time, the decision was made, and there was one part, and again, I must say something about the southeastern portion of the district, which now houses basically apartments where there is a large number of African American and Asians who eventually end over in Colonial Hill School because they are bused there. But that area was kept inside Worthington because there was a school board member that owned that property and wanted to keep in fact, if you see this Barnes Avenue in that area, that is why it was done. So
You're talking about Devonshire? You're talking about the area in Devonshire that goes to Colonial Hills on the other side of 71. Yes, interesting. I didn't know there was a.
And the question is, of course, at one point there was a time that you wanted to join that Colonial Hills and the evening streets, and the reaction was over our dead bodies. So, I've lived the whole thing, and I saw the problem when the busing came, and we had a lot of people trying to get into Worthington, and we had a policy that said, no, you can't go to your grandparents and do that. And but that's where we are now. I live in an area now in Wilson Hills, which is fairly well desegregated, and the school, the eastern part of the district is fairly well. And of course, when the problem was in the west part of the district, when it developed in higher property, and that it was an economic thing. It was not necessarily a race. Now, as far as Upper Arlington was concerned, one of my colleagues came in 1965, and he was the only Jewish family in Upper Arlington at that particular time. We had fought for equality in Philadelphia, and when I came to look at a house, my wife and I agree on houses all the time, so I came by myself, and our realtor tried to find out. I asked a question, and my realtor tried to find out in Philadelphia whether Joan was African American. But I have an old theory then, because I've seen it all over the world, and that is people it's bird of a feather tend to flock together, and that is inherent in our species, and that for whatever reason, bad or bad, it's inherent in our species, and unless you can overcome this, it's I don't know. I'm too old now.
I mean, there are actually arguments that segregation can be positive, particularly when you look at immigrant enclaves. Segregated immigrant enclaves can be places where you can see immigrants can revitalize communities. If you have an enclave of immigrants from the same country, sharing the same culture, working together in that way. So, I mean, there are instances where, you can see these, in the case of these immigrant enclaves, where having that segregation and maintaining that culture actually benefits that kind of microeconomy that they're able to build. And in that sense, I think, but I would argue that overall, well, people do tend to, gravitate towards those who we consider to be like us. There are some pretty compelling arguments for that diversity is actually beneficial.
Well, I'm not going to argue because we were in Philadelphia when Levittown developed, and Levittown in the area of New Jersey was a perfect example of redlining and all that stuff.
Yep, some of the biggest restricted communities. At that time, the FHA was requiring racial restrictions if you wanted federal mortgage insurance. So the Levitt and Sons and companies like that really, if they wanted to build desegregated communities, they had to look for other financing mechanisms.
Well, the advantages of getting old, I guess. You've seen it. You've seen a lot of things.
But I need to bring the official meeting to an end. But if you can stick around, Lennon, we can continue in this conversation after we finish the meeting. There are folks that need to get back to their various responsibilities. but frequently we get folks sticking around, especially on such a good topic. So if you can stay, I would appreciate that.
Happy to.
Okay. So to conclude our meeting, Rita Shornan is the president and CEO of Dave Thomas Foundation and will be our speaker for next month, speaking on adoption and the foundation. In terms of our four-way test, we have the ability to get that up or screen share that? No.
Sorry, I was not prepared.
Okay, so hopefully I will go slowly. The four-way test. And now, before we adjourn, please join me in reciting the four-way test. First,
The truth.
Is it the
is
truth?
it the truth? Second,
Is
is it
fair to all
fair to all
concerned?
Third,
Will it
Better friendships.
Friendships.
and fourth,
Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
It's usually redundant.
thank you. And that we lead to our adjournment, and if you can stick around for discussion, we'll continue.